Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 274, Galileo Part 6. Today will be our last in-depth episode on Galileo for a little while. We will walk right up to Galileo's Inquisition, and then we're going to pull back for a deep look at the Inquisition in general before proceeding. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I'm going to do that. One, I think everyone could use a bit of a break from the history of science at this point. I love the history of science, but even I will admit it can get a little tedious at times with discussions of, the tides and how different planets move and this experiment and that experiment. Number two, I'm sure you'll all remember quite easily that Galileo runs afoul of the Inquisition for allegedly advocating Copernicanism. A few weeks away won't cause you to forget that, and I'm going to remind you anyway. It's not that big of a deal. 3. Understanding how the Inquisition functions will make it a lot easier to understand Galileo as a trial. But before we get there, Galileo needs to publish. He needs to make the claim that's going to get him into trouble. Now, trouble's already been brewing for some time. But the pot continues to boil today as Galileo is confronted by a new fact that seemingly disproves Ptolemy: comets. Between August and November 1618, Galileo observed 3 comets in the night sky. One was visible to the naked eye. In fact, we are told that Europeans were so fascinated by this new heavenly body that everyone seemingly was willing to give up a night's sleep to observe it. Interestingly, Galileo did not devote time to studying these comets, certainly not the time that he had devoted to other heavenly bodies. The reason is simple. He was sick. Galileo was ill during the latter half of 1618 and was unable to make the observations we might have expected him to. His illness, of course, was to a degree genuine, but it was also partly political. It's highly likely that Galileo could sense the growing storm clouds on the horizon emanating from the general direction of Rome. If he did not observe the comets, then he would be under no obligation to comment on them, which at the moment seemed like the smart move. According to traditional astronomy, which held that change was impossible in the heavens, comets had to be a terrestrial phenomena. They had to be located somewhere in the upper atmosphere. According to the new astronomy, new stars and comets were obviously located in the heavens. They were, until the discovery of sunspots, the crucial evidence in favor of change in the heavens. The most important work on both of these phenomena had been done by Tycho Brahe, who had published on the new star of 1572 and the comet of 1577. In both cases, the main argument was from parallax, the idea that if novas or comets were close to the Earth, then observers looking at them from different places on the Earth's surface ought to see them located differently against the backdrop of fixed stars. Galileo had used precisely this argument in relation to the nova of 1604. Now, you can see how this works for yourself right now. If you hold up a finger before your eyes and you look at it first with one eye and then with the other, the finger will appear to move against the background of whatever's in front of you. The closer the finger is to you, you'll notice, the greater the movement. Such measurements can be carried out with the moon and can be used to calculate the moon's distance from the Earth. Since no parallax could be measured in the case of new stars and comets, they simply had to be further away. The comets of 1618 were therefore important for astronomers, but they were particularly important for Catholics, for they came hard on the heels of the condemnation of Copernicanism. If Galileo's Copernicanism was false, then there were two alternatives available, both of which placed the Earth unmoving at the center of a universe of fixed size. Aristotelian Ptolemaic astronomy, which denied the possibility of change in the heavens, and held that all heavenly objects circled around the Earth, and the astronomy of Tycho Brahe, which recognized the existence of change in the heavens, and held that the planets circled around the Sun while the Sun circled around the Earth. Every single one of Galileo's astronomical discoveries were at odds with the teachings of the Aristotelians, though every single one of them was compatible with the new astronomy of Tycho Brahe. For the Jesuit scientists in Rome, who had followed Galileo's discoveries closely and who carried out their own observations with telescopes, the conclusion was straightforward. Ptolemy was wrong. Their acknowledged leader, Clavius, had, before he died in 1612, expressed in print the view that the old cosmology would have to be abandoned. It simply was not compatible with the evidence. There had to be a new astronomy. But Copernicus was now forbidden, and so by elimination, that left only Tycho Brahe. The reason was so straightforward that the Jesuit scientists were convinced that even Galileo would adopt it. Interestingly, then, in 1619, Galileo co-authored a pamphlet essentially defending the Aristotelian view on comets. Many of his friends and supporters were shocked. They shouldn't have been. Galileo's argument was never a complete defense of Aristotle. It was much more nuanced than that. Galileo accepted Aristotle's claim that comets were far away, that they inhabited the upper atmosphere, but he rejected Aristotle's assertion that comets were burning fires. He believed that they were visual distortions, like rainbows. Galileo's arguments were stronger than Aristotle's, but they still had major flaws. For example, rainbows move when we move. That's because they're quite close to us. But comets don't, so how could they be like rainbows? Some historians actually believe Galileo was simply being provocative here. Given Galileo's preference for theory, I'm not so sure. It seems likely here that what Galileo was doing was not attacking Aristotle. He was attacking Tycho Brahe. Brahe believed that comets were much closer to Earth than Copernicus. Galileo was firmly on Copernicus' side. Hence, his argument was, in truth, directed at Brahe, not Aristotle. Galileo and his main opponent, a gentleman by the name of Orazio Grassi, continued to openly debate the matter, however. Neither man had anything significant to say, though. Still, the debate is significant for two reasons. First, because it tells us something important about Galileo, and second, because it provoked him to publish The Assayer, which is his most extended discussion of scientific methodology. So what does it tell us about Galileo? There was nothing in the Astronomical Balance, which was written in response to Galileo's position on the comets, that might have been expected to offend Galileo. Galileo was the one who picked the fight in the first place. And here his attitude is probably typical of many brilliant people. He simply could not abide anyone less brilliant than he. Most of his colleagues, Galileo felt, could not keep up with him intellectually, so there was little point in arguing with them. But the Assayer is the more important point here. First and foremost, this book contains Galileo's clearest exposition on the role of facts in scientific argument. Prior to the 17th century, it was sufficient to accumulate stacks of works by learned authorities to prove your case. Whoever had the bigger stack won. Galileo thought this was nonsense. He rejected all the authority of the ancients in favor of his own experience and the facts derived therefrom. In other words, what Galileo is really doing here is redefining what we call evidence. And the key was the telescope. With it, Galileo could see much more than Aristotle or Ptolemy. So their wisdom just wasn't worth as much as Galileo's observations. It wasn't their fault per se, they just had terrible technology. The second major assertion Galileo makes is that philosophy is not fiction. It's something that we must discover by reading the book of nature. Quoting Galileo here, philosophy is written in this very great book, which always lies open before our eyes, I mean the universe. But one cannot understand it unless one first learns to understand the language and recognize the characters in which it's written. It is written in a mathematical language, and the characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures. Without these means, it is humanly impossible to understand a word of it. Without these, there is only clueless scrabbling around in a dark labyrinth. End quote. This is perhaps the most famous passage in all of Galileo, and it represents a firm commitment to the realist theory of knowledge. The Assayer was not without its controversy, though. In it, Galileo espoused a clearly atomist view of the universe. But if atoms are fixed and do not magically change, then transubstantiation cannot be. And that really mattered in the 17th century, because transubstantiation, the sort of magical transformation of the bread and the wine during the Catholic Mass into the body and blood of Christ, had become a major dividing point between Protestants and Catholics. And of course, as a result, the Assayer was denounced by the Inquisition. And that gets us to a fundamental question. If Galileo had been banned from advocating Copernicanism, why did he seem to do so now? Or at the very least, why did he argue against Aristotle and Tycho Brahe, which was tantamount to advocating Copernicanism? I think the answer is that Galileo was in too deep. He had gone so far in the Starry Messenger that trying to pull back now simply wasn't going to happen. Galileo was determined not to be his father. He would not die a failure. He knew the truth, and he was willing to fight for it, at least for now. Late in 1622, after he had sent the manuscript of the Assayer off to Rome to be printed, Galileo began to revise his discourse on the tides. It seemed he was preparing to reopen the question of Copernicanism, despite the fact that he had been forbidden to do so. What made him think that circumstances had changed? True, his major opponent the first time around, Cardinal Berarami, had died the year before. So maybe Galileo assumed that animosity died with him. Even so, Galileo surely knew there was no prospect of publishing or even circulating a manuscript in defense of Copernicanism in Italy under the present circumstances. So what would be the point of updating his discourse on the tides? What we have here is a puzzle, and unfortunately, there's a missing piece. Fortunately, it's not too difficult to discover a piece that fits, that enables us to make sense of Galileo's behavior. In 1633, Leon Alacchi published a book on the intellectual life in Rome titled The Urban Bees. While the herbs in question is Rome, the title is also a pun. It's a reference to Pope Urban VIII, the bee being the symbol of the Barberini family. And in it, we find the following passage. Quote, "The French have a high opinion of Galileo, that some of them have come to Italy with the sole purpose of meeting with him. Indeed, I have learned from a reliable source that a person called Diodati, of noble birth, known for his science and his virtue, hurriedly came from France to Florence for this sole reason, and that, having spent the whole of 13 days talking to Galileo about various mysteries of nature, in order to satisfy his intellectual curiosity, judging that he was, as far as he was concerned, seeing Italy at Galileo's side, was all the Italy he needed to see. He returned to France, dropping all his other business and traveling in long stages." End quote. Diodati had written to Galileo in 1620, asking if he had plans for publication, and offering him help to get around any quote-unquote local obstacles. News of the condemnation of Copernicanism was now beginning to circulate among French intellectuals. Galileo replied, making it clear that he was prevented from publishing. The surviving correspondence would seem to suggest that there was no further contact between Galileo and Diodati for 5 years. But it seems unlikely that matters were allowed to rest there. What Alacchi reports is exactly what one would expect. A semi-clandestine visit by Diodati to discuss the probabilities of publishing abroad. Essentially, what Diodati brought with him was news of different individuals publishing abroad under both pseudonyms and in different ways that avoided contacting the ire of the Inquisition. He was providing Galileo with a model, a way to publish his findings without creating further controversy. Now, if Galileo had gone in that direction, there's every possibility that he never would have come into contact with the Inquisition again. But as we're about to see, he doesn't. And why he doesn't have anything to do with a lack of strategic sense. On August 6, 1623, Maffeo Barberini, a Florentine, was elected Pope Urban VIII. He would be the Pope during Galileo's Inquisition battles. In October of that year, Galileo's work The Assayer was also published. As soon as the book was printed, a local secretary to the Pope began reading it to him at mealtimes. This was, as Galileo would later recognize, a, quote, marvelous combination of circumstances, end quote. But to take full advantage of it, he needed to come to Rome. Yet Galileo delayed. The weather was bad, he was ill, he had to arrange for his orphan nephews to enter monasteries. We can imagine, though, that after the experiences of 1616, he was reluctant to revisit the scene of his defeat. When he finally set out in April of 1624, he delayed his arrival further, staying 2 weeks with his friend and patron, Federico Sessi. It was during this visit that Galileo performed the only experiment of which we have an eyewitness account. One day they went out on a boat ride on a local lake. While riding on the boat, which was powered by oars, Galileo asked his friend if he had anything heavy with him. His friend said yes, he did. A lock and key, which at the time would have been quite bulky. Galileo took the lock and key from him, tossed it up in the air. We know from his friend's later recollections that he was immediately distraught. He assumed that the lock and key was gone forever, that the boat would continue to move forward, but the lock and key would go backwards. Of course, it didn't. It landed right back in Galileo's hand. And thus, with a simple experiment, Galileo had shown how objects don't lose their motion when affected in another direction. Now, getting back to the much more important issue at hand. Pope Urban laid down 2 conditions for any publication of Copernicanism. First, it had to be presented as an arguable theory, with arguments for and against. Second, Galileo had to concede that there were limits, profound limits, when it came to human knowledge of scientific questions. In the end, all Urban wanted was another assayer. And so Galileo retreated into isolation to write. He wanted to give him one, but he also desperately wanted to defend Copernicanism. He began then writing a series of letters that analyzed the Copernican system of the universe and the Ptolemaic. Some may ask, well, why not Tycho Brahe's system? Well, Galileo believed because he had proven that Venus orbits the sun, no one could take Brahe seriously anymore. Galileo viewed the Tychonic, which is Tycho Brahe's system, as an adaptation of the Ptolemaic system. Tycho had done little more than adopt Aristotle's physics while following Copernicus's astronomy. Galileo believed all this was nonsense. But, of course, there's something worth pointing out here. Galileo had a telescope. Tycho Brahe did not. This innovation, not Galileo, was really what had shown Brahe to be mistaken. Galileo did not need to waste more ink proving the matter. Galileo wanted to push the topic forward, not go over old territory. He was now pressing the claim that the universe was spectacularly large. This was dangerous territory. The church held that the earth had to be the center of the universe because Christ has visited Earth. If the universe was populated by innumerable inhabited planets, well, then there might be innumerable Jesus Christs. That, the church asserted, was impossible. Galileo was on thin ice indeed. But then by 1628, his work had ground to a standstill. This was supposed to be his great opus on the Copernican and Ptolemaic systems. Yet it was not finished. But why? Well, to answer that question, we need to remember that Galileo was a real person. Not a painting, not some name in a history book. He had real-world relationships to deal with, and those were taking the prime position in his life at that moment. Sometime in 1627, Galileo encouraged his nephew to marry Anna di Cosimo di Calidi. Well, this might not seem like anything of any importance. Consider this. Galileo paid for Anna, the bride's, wedding dress and held the wedding in his home. But why? Why pay for some random person's wedding dress? The answer is that Anna wasn't random at all. She was Galileo's illegitimate daughter. This seems more likely the case after the wedding, when Galileo subsequently took responsibility for Anna's daughter. In fact, he treated his grandchild just like all the others. But this was just one piece of family drama that Galileo was dealing with. Galileo's younger brother, Michelangelo, had always been a bit of a disappointment. Sometime in August of 1628, just as Galileo was struggling to write, Michelangelo returned to Florence to get his wife and children and take them away. Galileo had been supporting them and told his brother that his family was better off staying here. The two brothers parted on bad terms, and Michelangelo died shortly thereafter, on January the 3rd, 1631. But there's more to the story. More headaches, if you ask Galileo. You see, Michelangelo had a son, and back in 1628, his son, Vincenzo, got into trouble in Rome. It seemed like, unfortunately, Vincenzo was a bit of a chip off the old block. His father had been a great disappointment, and he was prepared to also become a great disappointment. Galileo's friend Castelli had been looking after Vincenzo for Galileo, and Castelli was at the end of his rope. Vincenzo refused to abide by any lessons, he said, unless he beat him. Vincenzo wanted to be a musician, just like his father as well, and his grandfather before him. matters came to a head when he got into this altercation with his landlord. In a sort of moment when he forgot himself and forgot where he was, Rome, Vincenzo tried to insult his landlord by telling him, "You are a fool, you do nothing but worship, quote, painted mosaics," end quote. Well, this was, of course, pure blasphemy. No one was allowed to worship images of Christ and Mary and all the rest throughout churches in Italy. So to suggest that those were not representations of the real deities, well, that was something indeed. Castelli tried to intervene, but it was too late. Vincenzo found himself denounced to the Inquisition, and though we do not have all the details, it appears that he was tortured. Galileo was ultimately able to intervene on the part of his nephew and spirit him away, although the young man was never a success in life and wound up dying very young. We don't know exactly what kind of interactions happened between Vincenzo and Galileo after Galileo got his nephew out of Rome. But based off of Galileo's later incredible fear of the Inquisition, I think it's safe to assume Vincenzo told him some pretty awful war stories. We know that it was very common for the Inquisition to torture those who were not willing to admit their guilt right away. Vincenzo probably was tortured. And the stories that he heard from his nephew, well, they haunted Galileo until his own interaction with the Inquisition and, quite frankly, perhaps even beyond. In March of 1629, Galileo fell seriously ill. For the first time, he came face to face with the reality that he might not finish his life's work. Within a few weeks, he was well again, but it was not until October 1629 that he began writing once more. This time, he was encouraged by good news, the appointment of Niccolò Riccardi as master of the Sacred Palace. The master of the Sacred Palace was the Pope's personal theologian. Essentially, he was the person responsible for censoring books or for giving them the green light. And Riccardi had written words of praise for Galileo's Essayer years earlier. If Galileo was ever to get a work on Copernicus through the Vatican, now was the time. Galileo had hoped to finish his manuscript by the spring, but it was not until the end of January 1630 that he finally finished work on the Dialogue, a book he first began in 1597. It was just in the nick of time. His sight was failing, and with cataracts growing in both eyes, he knew soon he would be unable to read or write at all. In February, Galileo agreed to travel to Rome to make arrangements for publication, but he did not leave until April. Galileo arrived in Rome on May the 3rd and left on June the 29th, 1630. He met with the Pope and Riccardi and left with assurances he only needed to make a few small changes before he could publish. Ideally, Galileo wanted to dedicate the book to the Pope, if His Eminence would allow it. Galileo hoped to return to Rome with an edited manuscript that fall. There were 3 people Galileo had to convince in order to obtain permission to publish. First, there was the cardinal and nephew to the Pope, Francisco Barberini. Barberini had had a long private conversation with Castelli in February 1630, in which Castelli had outlined Galileo's theory of the tides caused by the movement of the Earth. Barberini had had one objection. If the Earth moved, did that not mean that it was a new star? And was that not theologically unacceptable? Castelli had reassured him. Galileo would certainly prove that the Earth was not a star. And certainly, after discussing the matter with Galileo, Castelli did just that. He worked to reassure Barberini that this argument over whether the Earth was a star was pure semantics and nothing more. Clearly, Galileo's telescope had shown that no 2 planets were alike. Thus, the distinction between the Earth and stars was as unnecessary as this distinction between the Earth and other planets. In the universe, he argued, no two things were exactly alike. The argument appeared to work. But while Barberini might have been convinced, it is telling that after Galileo's condemnation in the years ahead, he would remove any paintings or other representations from his home illustrating a Copernican universe. His support would prove not to be as strong as Galileo might have hoped. The second person Galileo had to convince was Raffaello Visconti, and the third was the Pope. These two men had very similar concerns. Really, all they needed Galileo to do was admit that there was more than one explanation for things. So long as Galileo made it clear that Copernicanism was one explanation for the universe, he was fine. Galileo needed to acknowledge that God could do things beyond human comprehension which might, and that's underlined, make Ptolemy right. Frankly, given the context of the early 17th century, this doesn't seem like a big ask. The way that Galileo's book is ultimately laid out is in a dialogue, which makes sense because the title of it is The Dialogue. It's a fictional dialogue between Copernicus, Aristotle, and Ptolemy. These men present their different arguments for how the universe is situated and discuss the merits of each. However, there's a fourth voice in the book. Throughout the margins, Galileo writes helpful notes for the reader. These notes are essentially Galileo speaking, even if he doesn't use his own voice. And Galileo speaking is firmly in Copernicus's corner. The book that Galileo took to Rome in 1630 was identical to that which was ultimately published. Hence, when Galileo put it to the press, he had to have known that he was not respecting the Pope's wish that he explain Copernicanism as the one explanation for the universe. After all, he kept in the argument about the tides, and the sole purpose of that argument was to proclaim Copernicanism as the only possible account for the structure of the heavens. Nevertheless, by the time Galileo left Florence, both Riccardi and Visconti had read the book and were determined not to stand in its way. Unfortunately, Galileo's luck did not hold. On August the 1st, Princesi, who I mentioned earlier, one of Galileo's biggest supporters, died. Had he lived, what followed might not have happened. Geopolitical events were also turning against Galileo. On July the 16th, Spain took Mantua from France in one of those never-ending Italian wars between the two great powers. Worse still, Sweden had just invaded Germany, this is during the 30 Years' War, and would soon ally itself with France, despite Sweden being a Protestant country. Pope Urban's position in all this was an unenviable one. He had spent crucial years as the Pope's representative in France, where he had formed connections that continued to shape his thinking. Moreover, France was the only power that could counterbalance Spain, and if Spain gained undisputed control over the Italian peninsula, the papacy would lose all of its freedom. Urban was thus consistently pro-French. But the 30 Years' War had begun in 1618, and in June of 1630, Sweden, encouraged by France, entered the war against the Habsburgs. If the Pope was an ally of France, then he was also an ally of the Protestants and an enemy of Catholicism. This was not a comfortable position for Pope Urban to be in. Nor was this good news for Galileo. Florence, like the Pope, wanted to avoid the irreversible choice between the two sides. But if the Pope was instinctively and consistently leaning towards France, then the Grand Dukes of Tuscany were, when the chips were down, allies of the Spanish. Indeed, in 1632, two princes of the Medici family, Francisco and Matthias, were in Germany fighting the Protestants. In 1624, Urban had been proud of his Florentine origins and had surrounded himself with fellow Florentines. Now he began to worry that their loyalties were divided. Rumors circulating in 1630 that he had fallen out with his secretary. Galileo and Urban were now potentially on opposite sides of a pan-European conflict. In 1630, there were bitter divisions in Rome between the supporters of France and Spain, the two sides coming to blows in the streets. The Spanish were putting pressure on the Pope by every means at their disposal. Early in 1630, they managed, at least for a moment, to persuade Pope Urban and Francisco Barberini to stop meeting with someone who was a known enemy of Spain. When Galileo arrived in Rome, there were rumors that he and this same person, who happened to be the greatest astrologers of the day, had predicted that the Pope would die that summer. It was reported that Spanish cardinals were setting out from Spain on the long journey to Rome in order to arrive in good time for the conclave that would elect the next Pope. The Spanish, in fact, were behaving as though Urban were already dead. As for the French, their cardinals also felt obliged to start towards Rome, fearing that a new pope would otherwise be elected in their absence. Urban, who took astrology seriously, was profoundly alarmed. He couldn't sleep at night, and he had all the birds in the papal gardens killed because the dawn chorus woke him from his fitful slumbers. While this moment of astrological history might not seem important, it turned out to have a lot to do with Galileo in the end. Galileo didn't have anything to do with this prediction about the Pope's death, but it turned out that someone else close to him did. The man was the name of Orazio Morandi. He was the abbot of a nearby monastery, and he was arrested that August and tortured. On the 7th of November 1630, he was found dead in his prison cell. Some say that he had been poisoned. The problem was that the two, Galileo and Morandi, had known each other since 1611 and been very close. Morandi, in fact, was trying to use his influence in order to get Galileo's book published. This now was incredibly problematic. Urban was anxious and suspicious of anyone who had been close to Morandi. Galileo, who had been on his way to Rome in an effort to try to get the book published there, now received advice from Castelli to reverse course. Galileo, who had anxiously followed the affairs surrounding Morandi, could not but agree. The book, he decided, would not be able to be published in Rome, after all. But at the moment, Galileo certainly had plenty of important things to worry about. The wife of the Florentine ambassador in Rome, who was also a good friend of Galileo's, and who could not be thought to represent the Florentine government, entered into negotiations with Riccardi on Galileo's behalf. At first, he demanded that the final text of the book be sent to him, but then he agreed to sign off on the book on two conditions. He had to see the beginning and the end, and the book must be reviewed in its entirety by a censor in Florence. He was happy for Galileo to suggest whoever he wanted. Now, if the book was going to be published in Florence, then full responsibility should have been transferred to the Florentine censors, and Galileo should not have been allowed to choose. The censor Galileo chose was a Dominican, Giacinto Stefani, and he chose well. According to Galileo, Stefani wept as he read the manuscript, so touched he was by Galileo's obedient submission to the requirements of the church. Riccardi, on the other hand, began to get cold feet. He was coming to think that Stefani was the wrong man for the job, and kept stalling when asked to give the final approval to the beginning and end of the book, evidently regretting the concessions he had made. In March 1631, Galileo asked the Grand Duke to intervene and put the ambassador himself to work on his behalf. His life, Galileo complained, was slipping away, and he was, he frankly confessed, in a state of anxiety and had been forced to take to his bed. He could neither eat nor sleep. He felt as if he was lost on an ocean without any prospect of making landfall. Galileo, of course, had never seen an ocean. But to make matters worse, he had become convinced that his intellectual prowess was fading away. And so the Grand Duke instructed the ambassador himself to come to Galileo's aid, and Riccardi agreed to write a memo to the Florentine Inquisitor explaining what the Pope wanted. But the biggest problem was that Galileo's views were not popular with those in charge, especially the Barberini family. Rather, Galileo himself, frankly, was not popular. The shift in official attitude towards Galileo that Castellini had predicted the previous August was the underlying reason for a lot of his difficulties. This was also a bad moment for the Medici to try to exert influence in Rome. Between 1625 and 1631, Urban had, in a series of steps, annexed the Duchy of Urbino to the Papal States. The heir to the last duke, who died on the 23rd of April 1631, was Vittoria della Rovere, who was betrothed to Ferdinando II, a Medici. In annexing Urbino, Urban was thus demonstrating complete disregard for the wishes of the Florentine government. Nonetheless, Galileo, through his intermediaries, continued to put pressure on Riccardi, and eventually, on the 19th of July, after Riccardi and the full weight of the Duke's authority had been brought to bear, there was the revisions that he required to make to the preface. Meanwhile, printing had already begun. Riccardi was not going to have any opportunity to have second thoughts. When the dialogue came out, many people were kind of interested to pick up a copy, and one of the people who was interested to read what he did was a Jesuit opponent. And this Jesuit opponent, when the book appeared in 1632, couldn't help but notice that a lot of the arguments about sunspots were very similar to a previous book written in 1630 called Orsini's Rose. In fact, modern historians, and I have to be honest here, have all concluded that there simply is no way, given the almost exact similarity between the two arguments, that Galileo came up with it on his own. Frankly, it seems likely that as Galileo was writing his book, he had a copy of Orsini's Rose next to him as he was doing so. So what I have to say is, unfortunately for many Galileo fans out of there, one of the biggest components of the dialogue was entirely plagiarized. Perhaps the most radical arguments in the dialogue are directed at undermining providentialist assumptions. We have no way of knowing, Galileo insists, whether the universe exists for our sake, for quite different purposes, or whether much of the universe serves no purpose at all. We have no way of judging whether it be thought of as large or small, assuming, as it is not, it may be finite. More remarkably still, Galileo's arguments proceeded by considering the theoretical possibility of non-terrestrial life. Here, Galileo argues through an intermediary that there might be life on the moon, although if it is, we can be sure that it's nothing like life on Earth. Quote, "I'm certain that a person born and raised in a huge forest among wild beasts and birds, and knowing nothing of the watery element, would never be able to frame in his imagination another world existing in nature different from his, filled with animals which could travel without legs or fast-beating wings, and not upon its surface alone, like beasts upon the earth, but everywhere within its depths, and not moving, but stopping motionless wherever they pleased, a thing which birds in the air cannot do. And that men lived there too, and built palaces and cities, and traveled with such ease that without tiring themselves at all, they could proceed to far countries with their families and households and whole cities. Now, as I say, I am sure that such a man could not, even with the liveliest of imagination, ever picture himself fish, ocean, ships, fleets, and armadas." End quote. Our understanding, therefore, Galileo insists, is just limited, and it's limited by our immediate experience. Even our imagination can work only upon the material that's provided by experience. It follows that we cannot possibly judge the purpose served by the universe. What could we possibly know about the purpose of the celestial bodies? He would write, quote, "It is great folly for us terrestrials to want to be arbitrators of the sizes and regulators of local dispositions, we being quite ignorant of all their affairs and interest." End quote. In place of a universe with humanity at its center, a universe made to serve humanity's purpose, a universe designed to make possible humanity's salvation, Galileo offers a mysterious universe whose purposes are unknown, whose size is unfathomable, and which may contain other things quite different from ourselves. We are not simply terrestrials. The moon may be uninhabited, but you do not have to force the text to find in it elements of heresy. Around other stars, Galileo writes, there may be other planets and other worlds which make the mistake of thinking that they are at the center of everything, and that their experiences are the true measure of reality. Ultimately, in writing the dialogue, Galileo ignored Urban's requests. He did not posit Copernicanism as one of several options. He posited Copernicanism as the option, and he removed the Earth from the center of the universe, both from a geographic situation as much as he also did from a theological standpoint. He had written his own death warrant. Now, as I mentioned, we are going to come back to Galileo's infamous trial with the Inquisition. In fact, his trial is probably one of the most famous of any trials that the Inquisition would hold. Certainly one of the most that we have the most resources for. I'll put it that way. But we're going to take some time to really understand the Inquisition. So starting next week, I'm going to turn back the clock a little bit to the 14th and 15th centuries and analyze the origins of the Inquisition. Because, as you may be surprised to find out, the Inquisition was quite old as an institution when it met Galileo, and some of the sheen was already coming off. Now, in the meantime, if you're interested in additional content, just check out the website or any of the links in the show notes to Western Civ 2.0 or the ad-free versions of the show. Those are all there, and there's always free trials.